Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Not Content Podcast. On this podcast, we pull from the seemingly endless queue of movies, television shows, and maybe even other surprises along the way as part of our podcast channel, From the Queue. On this episode, normally the first Tuesday, but this time the second Tuesday, we are going to do the right match. Tonight, we are pairing The Crow with Sting's retirement match.
In a world without justice, one man was chosen to protect the innocent and to make the wrong things right.
It's not a good day to be a bad guy.
The film the critics are calling dazzling and fiercely hypnotic.
Bye-bye, Bertie.
Brandon Lee is sensational. A triumph. Brandon Lee.
I love you.
The Crow. Rated R. Now playing at theaters everywhere.
Please subscribe, like, and review From the Queue on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, especially Spotify and Apple, as you can get those algorithms going with positive feedback. You can find our channel on BlueSky at From the Queue. You can also find us through Instagram at From the Queue and Threads. If you are listening to us on YouTube, all our links will be in the description below. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Instagram at Jerome Cuson. You can find me on BlueSky at JeromeC1985. My co-host is Brian. You can find him on Twitter for now at Brian to Brain. Brian, this was your suggestion. Now, coming into this, I was into the idea of doing The Crow finally. Like, this is something that we had talked about doing during Superhero Pantheon for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe it was subconscious at this point. It just didn't happen. And I was into the idea of doing The Crow, and I was like, okay, this is going to be really interesting. And then I started watching The Crow, and I realized I was not going to be into The Crow. So that's where we're at. But thankfully, we have something much better to talk about after the movie. So it's good that we are talking about The Crow, because I don't imagine our conversation is going to be very long in this case. But thankfully, we have paired it up with a match that I know means a lot to you. But Brian, before we get to that, let's rip the Band-Aid off. Let's talk about this cursed movie.
Yeah, so neither one of us had actually seen the movie until we decided to watch it. So that was really interesting, considering that I think The Crow, especially amongst my friends, is like a really like big cult classic that's really like, you know, they really hold it to their heart. And I understand that. I think it's just the style and the way that you kind of remember this movie. If you had seen this movie in the 90s, like, it probably sticks with you all these years later. But for us, me and Jerome, we watched it just recently, so it's kind of clear to us that, like, oh, the first 15 minutes are missing because Brandon Lee died. So let's get into the background of all that really quickly first, obviously. So we're actually coming up on the 30th anniversary of this movie. This was released in May 13th, 1994. You know, cult classic. Budget of $23 million, grossed $94 million worldwide. One little thing I noticed here is that it averaged about $7,000, a little more than $7,000 per screening on opening weekend, which is ridiculous. So my understanding is, like, I'm betting that people like watched it because Brandon Lee died, and that was part of like the advertising, because we know like The Dark Knight had the same effect on people and probably pushed it over the top in terms of that 500 million mark. Million.
I think we need to mention who Brandon Lee is the son of, and I think that also contributes a lot to it as well.
Of course, the son of Bruce Lee, the legend, the GOAT, some people call him. And, you know, people thought that Brandon Lee was going to live up to his father's legacy and become an action star. And he was on the way to do that. He did some small martial arts roles before that. I mean, he certainly has the look. He looked like a superstar. He looked like he was going to break out in the 90s and become this huge megastar. And you can tell people, like, even like before the movie came out, I think, and when they heard about his death, like, there's something to him that people are drawn to him. You know what I mean? And people were like that with Heath Ledger. So it's not surprising that someone, like, when they die early, they kind of, like, you know, become bigger than when they were alive, this legend, so to speak. And it's unfortunate because you would think that we would learn from his tragic death on set with like a gun that wasn't properly inspected, and it looks like the people on set that were supposed to be inspecting the guns left early that day or whatever. And of course, we got that incident with Alec Baldwin's movie last year. So you would think we would have learned, but apparently we haven't. And it's just kind of like, wow, like we're still having these accidents today. And yeah, it's just kind of shocking when you kind of look over the history of some of these on-set incidences. And of course, we can talk about the Twilight Zone another time.
Isn't it weird that we have this Crow character? Of course, we have the tragic passing of Brandon Lee, and I think that in many ways morally compromises this movie. And I think we could make a solid argument whether this movie should even exist. But it's weird to me that here you have Brandon Lee who passes away as the Crow. Sting becomes a version of this character, and then somebody who does kind of a parody of his entrance, Owen Hart, has his own tragedy and passes away in the middle of the ring a few years after Crow Sting. So it's just really weird, the connections that are made. Like, you can connect Brandon Lee and Owen Hart in some way, and that is really depressing.
I know, man. And there's a lot of weird connections too. Like, so I kind of teased last week about the movie Nope, right? It had Michael Wincott as the cameraman, right? Michael Wincott is the bad guy in this movie. And it's just so weird that I don't know if he was exactly on set. I don't think he was the person that actually shot him, but man, it's just so weird that he was cast in Nope, and Nope is about, or has that scene with, you know, the animal killing people on the set. And he was on, you know, probably not exactly the same day on the set, but, you know, being on the same production as the Crow. So I think that kind of casting, when that happened and Nope, no one was like paying attention except me. And when I explained that to my buddy, he was like, "Whoa, that's a weird connection. How did you pick up on that?" And you just kind of put two and two together, because Michael Wincott is like very much a 90s actor or 2000s kind of actor. Like you'll probably remember him from like Robin Hood, and he's got that weird like accent to him, but he's got this very like heelish kind of look, which is why he was cast for this movie, obviously. So him like being cast in Nope, I thought was just really like spot on in a weird kind of way, knowing that he's lived that kind of tragedy. So I thought that was like a really interesting casting. Jordan Peele.
Fittingly, he is also in Strange Days as well, which, if you know who he is.
Right. And so Alex Proyas, yes, director of the movie. I confused that movie with this other movie. What is it? Dark City. So I confuse Dark City and Strange Days all the time, but I guess those are two of those movies that, you know, are kind of like those weird sci-fi 90s movies that eventually got to check out. But and then Alex Proyas kind of had like a minimal career after this. So it's just kind of weird where his career went, like after directing The Crow and all the reworkings he had to do. And you know, he was like, Brandon Lee had like 3 more days of filming, right? So if you watch this movie, it's clear, like if you kind of studied any like script structure, it's clear that they skipped like parts of the first act and you kind of jump into the second act almost, and it's like, whoa, what the fuck is going on? And you know, for a screenwriter, for, you know, people that have taken classes like me and Jerome, like it's clear that like, yeah, there's stuff missing and they just kind of edited around it. But I think if you don't have that kind of eye in the 90s and you're not like thinking about the script like that, you're probably gonna have a better ride with the movie, and you're gonna enjoy it more. And I think that's what happened with people in the 90s. But for people like us nowadays who are just kind of like watching it for the first time and kind of analyzing the script, it's clear like they missed the beginning. Like they didn't shoot the beginning of the movie Brandon Lee. Like it starts with him and his death, and then all of a sudden he's popping out of the coffin, and it's like, who is this guy? So there's like no introduction of these characters. It just jumps in, and like we just don't know who anybody is. And it's kind of like, okay, you know, it's based on a comic. I guess these are just the comic book characters, and they're just kind of introducing us. But it sucks because like we didn't get to know this like Eric Draven character, and I feel like this movie would have been even more like impactful, more memorable if they, you know, filled that in and you got to know him before he gets murdered. But yeah, that hasn't happened. So they just kind of jump in, and that's kind of where that editing and then the last minute rewriting kind of had to fill in, and they put in like his stunt double to fill in the work. So it's clear like there's obviously it's like a stunt double in some of these scenes, but I gotta say, like the performance for what Brandon Lee did was like kind of haunting and chilling, and it's like he doesn't know, like he's acting like as if his body doesn't know what's going on, which is clearly that's what's going on. And it's really like a chilling performance, like not just because he died, but just the fact that like he's skinny and he's like shaking all the time, and he's cold because he has his shirt off all the time, but like it's raining all the time, and it feels like his body's like re-experiencing and re-remembering things. And that probably does that's probably what is going to happen if you do come back from the dead. So it's kind of like a shocking kind of thing, but his performance is really solid, I think, and that's kind of what carries the movie, obviously. But obviously they got some weird characters in this. Like the bad guys are just so weird. I recognize one of the bad guys
bizarre.
too.
I mean, one of the villains is Candyman, so we got that going for us in this movie.
One of the other villains is also one of the bad guys from Untouchables. I don't know if you noticed, the guy that gets thrown off the roof in Untouchables. That's the guy with the long hair.
And also Joe Pizzullo, is that his name? He was on Homicide. He's in a bunch of Coen Brothers movies as well.
Oh yeah, that mustache and that size and that voice.
He's very distinct. He's very distinct. I think this movie is very weird. It doesn't really situate us in a time. Like, this is Detroit, but it's a bombed out Detroit, which I guess maybe that's what they're going for, clearly. And the fact that they don't situate us in a time, they fridge Draven's girlfriend, like, right from the start. And, like, they basically say, like, all the worst stuff that could ever happened to her. So they don't really give her any character development. Like, he's kind of watching over this child. There's a lot of really weird choices. The only difference between a movie like this and Death Wish is the supernatural goth elements, and I think some of it is okay, but I'm not a super gothy person, as you would imagine from years of listening to me on this show. But this movie kind of feels like there's times I was like, okay, this kind of reminds me of Spawn. This definitely also reminds me of Strange Days, which is an incredible movie, by the way. And I think at some point we should probably review that, because it's doing a lot of the similar visual things and cues, but doing them much better. And clearly that movie had a little bit more of a budget, although not as successful financially. I think I'll say this, the first 15 minutes were rough. It definitely gets better. Brandon Lee is very charismatic. It is an absolute shame that we never got to see him like fully realized, because I think he is somebody who could have had a positive impact in, these action movies. I mean, can you imagine, if Brandon Lee lives and we get Brandon Lee in a John Wick movie? Like, just imagine the spawn of Bruce Lee in a John Wick movie. I mean, it just, like, you can't, like, that is unbelievable booking that could have happened. And I mean, again, it's just an absolute tragedy that we lost him, not because of that, but just because in general. I want to talk about the cinematographer. So I know that you and I were kind of a fan of some of the shots in this movie. Dariusz Wolski is the cinematographer, and he has a really fascinating career, Brian. I don't know if you realize this, but he was the cinematographer for Crimson Tide, directed by Tony Scott. Then he was Tony Scott's cinematographer on The Fan. He was also the cinematographer for Sweeney Todd, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, all of them, all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. He was the cinematographer for a bunch of Ridley Scott things, including the 2 Alien sequels and The Martian. And he was most recently the cinematographer for House of Gucci and Napoleon. So he is very much entrenched with one Ridley Scott. So he is very much matured into becoming a pretty solid cinematographer. And that's the thing, man. Like, you look at a cinematographer's IMDb, you're going to see some wild choices, because they're very much like just doing the work of like making movies look as good as they can be. And I don't know if they have some of the pretensions that the directors do, because you get these wide variances in quality. And it's just, he's had a really fascinating career, and he has definitely gone on to do some really good work. I would say, like, of the movies I mentioned, The Martian is probably my favorite in terms of the look, but obviously he has done a lot of very good work since then. And in many ways, I think this movie is kind of a precursor to a lot better work. So that's kind of where I come down. I think this movie is just okay. I think there are some interesting moments, but there is nothing that really like brings me into it all the way in terms of plot, in terms of character. And fundamentally, like, in order for me to really get into a movie, I have to fall in love with something, right?
I get you, man. I get you, and I feel like there's a lot of missed opportunity because I feel like Michael Wincott could have been this epic, like heel bad guy because he can fit that role so well. But they just threw this weird storyline with him and Bai Ling, like his half sister, and they're like fucking, and it's like this incest thing. So it's like, what the fuck is going on here? But we don't know any of these people. Like they just jump in. So I think that's a big issue. Is like we don't get to know anybody, and all these like weird events start happening, and everything is on Halloween. So that was kind of like, oh, it's Halloween. So originally I thought this movie was going to take place all at night, but it kind of spread into the daytime. It's like, oh man, I kind of wish it was all at night, but you know, they kind of had to spread it out a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of like this movie's legacy is just Brandon Lee as like the Crow and how it kind of transitioned, or like the gimmick, so to speak, because was kind of like given to Sting, so to speak, and yeah, and then you know Sting became the Crow and Starkey '97 happened and all that bullshit. But still, like, I think Scott Hall's the one that may have suggested it to Sting. That's the story that I've heard is that's made the rounds. But I mean, if you look at the
Sting has kind of debunked that. I mean, he's kind of said that wasn't true. So who knows? I mean, it's wrestling. They're all carnies. They're all bullshitters.
Yeah.
So who knows what is actually
they're probably misremembering or something. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me because we know Scott Hall had that business creative kind of mindset. Like the fact that he did the Scarface gimmick in a PG WWF era and got away with the fact that he called it the Razor's Edge, which is about cocaine, which also ties into this movie because from what I've read and heard,
there's a lot of cocaine in this movie.
A lot of cocaine, not just not just on camera, because there is a lot of cocaine on camera, but behind the scenes, like a lot of people were on coke, and it was just like that '90s lifestyle, quote unquote. And
I mean, it's a reverberation of the '80s more so than the '90s. I think by the '90s, I think you're starting to get away from that because I don't ever underestimate the thing like Len Bias dying, River Phoenix dying. Like, don't ever let that, because I think that has a lot of influence on the way that celebrities do things. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if that era is kind of ending. This is kind of a last gasp for that, and fittingly, somebody dies because of it. I want to know, Brian. I know we don't do the burning questions on this, but what did Ernie Hudson do with his paycheck, do you think?
I don't know, man, because I don't think he got paid much, it seems like, you know what I mean? Like, he's such a side character. It felt like they were just giving him a job. So
I popped when he said Draven might be a ghost, though. I absolutely did.
At least he was the one character that it was like trying to rationalize everything that was going on. So that was kind of interesting. I kind of think he's more of a specter or a wraith. Those are the revengeful type spirits, but it's kind of what it is. I wish they would have explained it more, but they don't, and they just kind of associate this crow that appears out of nowhere as like this conduit to the underworld or something. Very weird stuff, and I wish they just would have explained it more. But my MVP is definitely the cinematographer Darius Wolski. In my opinion, like it feels like Ridley Scott's been kind of riding his coattails the last 15 years or so. Because, like, no matter how you feel about those Alien movies and Prometheus, like, they still look really awesome. Like, really awesome and distinctive, like, cinematography-wise. And that's the one thing I've noticed about Ridley Scott in the last couple of years is, like, I may not be interested in some of his, like, the subject matter of his films, but goddamn, they look awesome. And, Exodus, Gods and Kings is, like, one of my least favorite Ridley Scott movies, but it's, like, in a top 5 of his that looks awesome and beautiful. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of that. And I would say best performance obviously is Brandon Lee. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the math on this and the budget or the box office, this did bonkers, gangbusters. And it's no wonder they made all these like straight to video sequels that are just copies of the same plot over and over. We even got one with Edward Furlong, for crying out loud. And good God, that doesn't work at all. So it feels like they're just trying to recapture that magic, that lightning in a bottle that happened. I don't know if it's going to work ever again. And we just got a preview image of the new Crow, with which Skarsgård is this? I forget the one from It. Bill Skarsgård, I believe.
Bill Skarsgård, and then the funny thing is, he looks like Darby Allin,
which is weird, right? It's so weird how that. I don't know. I don't know if they did that on purpose to fuck with wrestling fans. I don't know. It's just so
I don't think weird. Would, but I mean, it's definitely a little bit on the weird side. So I do have to say that because I'm just looking through some of the other things that some of the crew members have done. So Dove Henning, who is the editor of this movie, Brian, let's talk about some of the other things because I'm going to say he's the MVP of this movie because I can't. This has to be a complete nightmare. I cannot even imagine putting this movie together with Brandon Lee dying, with all of the cocaine that was being done. I have to imagine that he played a really important role in making sure that this movie was passable, was something that you could get out there. And the fact that this was 1 hour and 42 minutes is probably a testament to his skills. But I will tell you that he is heavily involved with Michael Mann. He did 6 editing jobs for Michael Mann, including Thief, including Manhunter, including Last of the Mohicans, and Heat. He is the editor of Heat. The editor of Heat also edited this movie. That is fucking wild. He was also a quote unquote additional editor on The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. So I don't even know what that means, but he was also the editor of Street Fighter as well. So clearly 1994 was a rough year for him, but I'm hopeful that he got paid. He was also the editor for a number of Andrew Davis movies. Andrew Davis, probably most famous for The Fugitive.
I mean, he certainly had a job ahead of him because, like, it's clear that, like, he just said, "Fuck it, let's just start at the like right when he dies. Let's just go from there, and like let the audience just get sucked right in." And that's what happened. So we don't get this like background kind of beginning, and there was none. They didn't film it, so they kind of had to just jump right in. And I think he did a good job for what he was assigned to do, because clearly this was like a miracle job. Like, if I was taking over as editor, I probably would have made the same decisions and just kind of like, okay, we're just gonna just eliminate the first 15 minutes and just go from there, and hopefully everyone just attaches to the characters and gets along with the ride and goes with it. So that's kind of what happened, and he did a good job.
So I'm sorry to do this to you, but so I'm now looking at the composer Graham A. Revell and his IMDb. Do you want to know some of the other movies that he did music for? You're gonna love this.
Go for it.
Strange Days, which makes sense. From Dusk Till Dawn, Spawn, and my favorite, the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie.
It's amazing that you said Spawn, because it, again, like you mentioned it earlier, like this has a Spawn feel to it, and it certainly does, man.
It absolutely has a Spawn feel to it.
It's that vibe and the editing and a little bit of that.
I'm not convinced that it's the music. Like subconsciously, this movie was telling me that it had the same musicians involved with it.
Well, I mean, if you look at the track listing, because this, I was about to say that too, like the soundtrack for this movie is really good, like really, really good. Because I'm a fan of some of these like bands, like Rage Against the Machine, Nine Inch Nails, Stone Temple Pilots, The Cure. Like, dude, those are like some of the top bands from that era. And I think the soundtrack is really great. And I know like people love the soundtrack as well. It's kind of one of those legacy soundtracks that kind of people pick up over the years and kind of re-download it over the years. So yeah, I think the soundtrack was great. It's like everything they could possibly do to make up for the fact that Brandon Lee died, they did, and somehow they just ended up with a winner. So in terms of box office, not in terms of like quality maybe, but I mean, this is memorable. I can't deny that it is memorable.
Byproduct of its time. That's all it is. I mean,
yeah.
I think when you look at this movie, you just have to understand that this is a quintessential 1990s movie, and that's okay. Like that's fine, but I think you really have to walk into this with low expectations and just understand that this is a byproduct of its time. And we will see what happens as 2024, 2025, as we get into, you just get the feeling that we are going to start seeing more independent productions. And, this did have some studio affiliation, but I'm very curious to see where we go, and seeing if we get, maybe not this kind of movie where somebody has a tragically dies, but if we get something that feels a little grittier, feels a little more down to earth, because yes, there are a lot of explosions, but this movie still feels pretty down to earth. Speaking of not down to earth, why don't you talk about your superhero?
Oh boy. Okay. So Sting, I guess I've realized I guess it's the AEW run, but Sting is like my number one. Like in terms of like wrestler heroes, general list of heroes, I guess. I never realized it until this run, and just him, like, and everyone being so nostalgic for him, and then teaming with Darby, um, it's just wow. It's like it just made me realize how much I love the guy so much, and I think that happened to a lot of people too because he got voted in the Wrestling Goes Hall of Fame recently because of this run. I think. Um, I wasn't really like a big fan of his TNA run. I was a fan of like the first couple years, and then I just kind of like drifted away from TNA. But when I was growing up, man, like Sting, it was always the Sting toy that I wanted to play with the most, more than Hogan. Brett was pretty close. I wanted to see Sting and Brett, and when that happened at that Halloween Havoc, I was super disappointed. But yeah, man, Sting is probably my go-to. I remember borrowing the tape from my late uncle in the 90s of Clash of the Champions 1 and watching that for the first time and being like, whoa. And because I had already seen Sting like in the 90s. Like this was when I saw him in 88 for the first time, like the 80s Sting. And this was like me and like when I was 5 or 6 years old in the mid 90s and just kind of seeing him. And it was like, wow, this guy's like captivating. You know what I mean? And the charisma and all that stuff. And he might not be like Hogan charisma, but he's got that certain charisma that kind of draws you in. And he certainly drew me in, man. And I was definitely a little sticker growing up. I tried to paint my face the red, white, and blue style for Halloween. I swear to God, I tried. It didn't work out, but I tried. But yeah, that iconic look at the Great American Bash 90 is just incredible. He kind of recreated that for that New Japan show in 91. I know a lot of Sting history, man, and I know the ins and outs of his career. This final match is definitely in the top 5 of his career. I would say so for sure in terms of the drama and all the crazy shenanigans going with it. But I mean, if you want some recommendations, obviously it's like Sting and Vader, like any one of them. I'm more particular towards the '92 Starrcade match because I felt like that was the first time Sting actually beat Vader on TV, and that was a big deal. Because at that point, it was just like Sting was like losing to Vader like on house shows, and he lost at the Great American Bash that year. So that was kind of like him getting his comeuppance and getting even with Vader. So that's kind of like my favorite Sting Vader match, and I know people love that strap match, which is incredibly brutal. But there's something about that '92 match where it was just kind of like Sting taking all the blows at the beginning and then having that comeback at the end. Really dig that. I always love that Steiners match. Sting and Luger versus the Steiners, always going to be at the top of my list in terms of tag team matches. Yeah, and of course the 2 War Games matches that he did in 91 and 92 were spectacular. 91 is the one where Brian Pillman unfortunately gets dropped on his head by Sid, but still a dramatic match. And then of course 92 is where they just went balls to the wall and tore the ring down and were just everyone was bleeding. Every person
in the match except Sting bleeds, I think.
I believe so. And maybe Nikita Koloff didn't bleed either, but still, like, that match is just so legendary.
Yeah, those are the ones. But, I mean, Dustin Rhodes was a mess in that match.
Oh, yeah. And especially, like, yeah, if you see the 93 one as well, no one was supposed to bleed in that one, and Dustin bled. I think he got fined for that one. I'm not sure, but
93 one, great. I mean, it's okay, but it's definitely a huge step down. 92 is really the last good War Games that we have in the WCW era.
For sure, and that's definitely one of my top Sting matches as well. But yeah, like I'm a big fan of like Surfer Sting a lot more so than Crow, and I know people are very much into the Crow Sting, but there's something about the bright colors and that era, and it's so nostalgic, and it just kind of goes with that WCW aesthetic of that time when WCW had the bright colored ropes and the white mat or the light blue mat. Love that era. Of course, we went to the Crow. Definitely changing his look, but I think the idea of him not talking and him, like the idea that WCW turned his back on him, like he feels like they turned his back on him, was like a powerful idea, part of the storyline. And I think he doesn't get enough credit for doing that promo. And you'll probably agree with me on this one, that promo before he goes Crow. He's talking. I think it's the night after Fall Brawl where they questioned him and the fake Sting came out and he almost saved the day. And then he comes out, turns his back to the hard cam and starts cutting the promo and says that WCW turned his back on him. Such a like visual metaphor that I thought like, I don't know who thought of that part, but like the most memorable Sting promo in my opinion is that one for sure. Because of the what it meant. So, he was the face of WCW. And then of course, the Hogan stuff, it felt like, oh, we're going with Hogan now. We're going with like a bigger star than you, so to speak. And he kind of went against that and became like this big enigma in 97. And we all know about Starrcade, but yeah, that's kind of where his career trajectory went, and he pretty much went to the Crow look for the rest of his career, kind of altering it up a little bit, going the red and black, despite how you feel about that and that stupid goatee he had. But Yeah, like I'm much more of a fan of like Surfer Sting and that probably the 97 Sting as well, him just pointing the bat to the crowd and not saying a word, and JJ Dillon's like, "What do you want, Sting? Just tell me what you want." And he's pointing that sign that says Sting versus Hogan. Like I'll always remember that. So like I have a lot of great memories of Sting, and definitely one of my top favorite wrestlers of all time. I'd say at this moment he's my favorite of all time, but who knows, that can change. But I think this match with the Bucks really put him over the top, and it kind of showed that not only did he want to go out his way, but he went out in the modern kind of style. Like no one expected this thing to go through glass, and he did. So he went out on top, and he sold a table spot, but it doesn't matter because that's what the crowd wanted. And Jerome, like this match was very violent, but I'm sure you enjoyed it because
the idea is that
Sting match, pretty much, right?
Like, AEW is the first and only company to book Sting as a superhero. And look, Sting didn't put anybody over, but I mean, if you look at his career and you look at what he did, I mean, look at Great American Bash 92. How many baby faces would have the balls to take that kind of a beating from Vader? I guarantee you, Hulk Hogan, Rock, those guys are not taking that kind of punishment from Vader, or quite frankly, from anyone else. I mean, John Cena did from Brock Lesnar at the one SummerSlam. So I would take Cena out of that conversation, but Sting is one of the very few that would do that. How many guys would have put up with what happened at Starrcade 97? Like there are a lot of guys who would have quit, and they would have been justified in doing so. I mean, Sting got screwed over royally, which is ironic given Bret Hart's involvement. But the problem is that nobody ever took care of Sting. That's the story of his career. And I'm glad that he is your favorite wrestler. I know that he is a lot of people's favorite wrestler. I was always more of a WWF person. So Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, Steve Austin, those were more of my guys. Sting wasn't as much because I wasn't super into WCW. Obviously, I've since gone back and I've watched his better matches. I mean, his series with Vader is tremendous. I think Sting has a couple of problems. Number one, a lot of his best matches come against Ric Flair. Ric Flair, the perception being he could carry a broomstick to a 3-star match. So he's not going to get the credit that he deserves just having great matches with Ric Flair. Other problem is the Vader matches, number one, are not very well seen. And in terms of Vader, his relevance, I mean, he's basically irrelevant by the time the Attitude Era starts. Like he's in the WWF for a little while, but he's calling himself a fat piece of shit by September 98 and he is off to Japan where he obviously has a lot of success in the late 90s and early 2000s before his passing in the last few years. But I think that's part of Sting's problem. The other problem is wrestling for WCW when it was the number 2 company. When it's the number 1 company, he's in the rafters. He comes back to WCW, and that's when the wheels start falling off. A couple of his best matches are in 1999, one of them being a WCW title match against Diamond Dallas Page. It is a really good match, but then Sting loses the world title back to Diamond Dallas Page an hour later. So the meaning of the match is really nullified in so many ways. But, Sting has a tremendous amount of talent. I would say that in terms of the really interesting Sting matches, I look at something like Bound for Glory 2011 when he carried the corpse of Hulk Hogan to a 3-star match. It's not great, but Sting is 100% the reason that the match is even passable. And I know that it's kind of a last gasp of Hulkamania and getting to see that one last time essentially, but Sting is the person who makes that work. And in listening to the TNH series on The Lapsed Fan, you really develop an appreciation for Sting. Because look, TNA is bad. What's going on is really, really bad. But boy, oh boy, is it great to hear Sting on promos and to hear Sting just get a chance to cut some of the best promos of his life. Because that's where he finally discovered himself as a promo. It took 15 fucking years, and he finally did it in TNA when nobody was watching. It's kind of sad, but I think it naturally leads us into the AEW run because he does cut some good promos. He was in all tag matches. He took some big bumps. The thing is that, again, he went undefeated. He didn't put anyone over. But I don't think that's not the Sting that was ever presented in AEW. Again, they protected him extremely well. I mean, in terms of like the old man run, it's him and Terry Funk. And quite frankly, Terry Funk, even some of his ending matches were pretty rough. I think Sting is 64. He wants to go home. I totally get it. This was a great last 2 or 3 year run. I believe it started during the pandemic. But I'm glad that he got to end things kind of on his terms. In Greensboro with Shivani and JR on the call, he clearly had a voice, and I think he made the right choice. The Young Bucks 100% were the right choice for his final opponents. There's no scenario, there's no other group of individuals that would otherwise be on that roster who I think would have done a better job. Because the thing about the Young Bucks, regardless of your feelings on them personally, if you watch a Young Bucks PWG match, when it's time for them to lose, when it is time for them to get their asses handed to them, they are probably two of the best.
Absolutely. That's why I kind of akin this to like a guerrilla warfare tag match from back in the Reseda days, because I've seen those, and the Bucks were definitely taking their licks. You know what I'm saying? Because it was all about beating up the Bucks and getting the big W on the Bucks at the end, and that's exactly what this was. And the way it was structured was fine. It was perfect. Like, they did a little brawl at the beginning. You saw Sting's kids dressed up in the USA paint and the Crow, or NWO Crow, whatever, red and black. I was shocked because I was like, oh my God, is that Sting? And then I realized, oh, that's a double. But then when you find out that it's his kids, it makes that moment even more special. And I'm so glad they did that, because then it becomes, again, fathers and sons and legacies and generations and all that kind of thing. And how Sting's been a generational guy for 40 years. And he's for grandfathers and fathers and sons, he's been there for all three generations. So I think it was fitting that he has his kids there. And then, of course, they kind of break it down where they get kind of the table spots at the beginning, and it looks like Darby and Sting are going to lose at the beginning. Small comeback. Darby does the craziest spot in the last 5 years, probably. I don't know how you feel about that spot, but it was gross. But at the same time, it was I
mean, that's the thing, is that I saw people criticizing it, and look, I don't want to see anybody get hurt from the glass, but it's not like he immediately got up, no-sold it, and then did three crazier things. It had significance. So again, I would classify myself as AEW agnostic. I'm not necessarily a fan of a lot of what they do, but in this specific instance, I think people are stupid.
Yeah, because he was gone for 10 minutes after that, and then it just led to the finish. Because that makes sense. He's going to make the save at the end, and they're just going to focus on Sting getting beat up and having these epic comebacks and kicking out at one, taking double super kicks, going through tables, going through glass, and it was just dramatic. You know what I mean? And I was biting at every moment, thinking oh, this is it. Oh, this is it. They did the Ric Flair tease, because I knew knowing the Bucks, it's obvious they were going to do that the whole I'm sorry, I love you gimmick in some way or fashion, and then, of course they did it. I love the way they pulled it off, and then, of course, it was a near fall. Everyone getting involved. Steamboat got involved. I got emotional when I heard the WCW 90s Steamboat theme. Not the one where they talk about he's a family man, but that instrumental version. Oh, man, that got me nostalgic. I pop every time I hear that for Steamboat. So that was cool. I almost wanted Luger to be out there, but I guess he couldn't be on camera because he has a Legends deal with WWE. But people were wanting him to do the whole thing where he slaps Sting and is get in there and kick his you-know-what, because that's what Sting did for Luger and kind of made that Luger the babyface in that match at WrestleWar 90, which was all convoluted because Sting was supposed to be in that match. And, of course, he hurt his knee on that Clash of the Champions. And they didn't know what to do, and they gave the slot to Luger, and Luger was a heel at the time, so everyone's like, what the fuck is going on? And when Sting comes out and slaps Luger, it made Luger a babyface in that moment, and the crowd bought into the last 5 minutes of that match, and it turned Luger into a babyface from 90 until 91. But if Sting doesn't do that, I don't think that match is as memorable when Sting comes out hobbling around. So that's kind of what I wanted for Luger, but he wasn't able to do that. But at least Luger was taking backstage photos and stuff like that. Seeing Nikita Koloff and Magnum TA sit together, just unbelievable and nostalgic, and that wasn't even my time. That was 86. I was born in 88, but I went back and looked at whatever I could find on that series. Not every match was filmed for that best of 7, but the ones that were filmed, I was like, wow, considering that Magnum T is not even like the in-ring general that like a Ric Flair is, there's something about Nikita and Magnum where they're just like rough and tough manliness kind of becomes like the story, and you become engrossed in it because it's not like a technical masterpiece, but they're really going at it. And that's what you got for all 7 matches. It was actually 8 matches technically, but still, like, just seeing those 2 there was like, wow, man, just like that's history right there. And it looked like Nikita Koloff can just take off his jacket and get in the ring right now, which I know is very strange to say, but the dude looked kind of like jacked under that coat. So, and we know Nikita Koloff has always been known to be jacked to the gills and stuff like that. So that was really cool to see. And, I was just marking out, because Charlotte, the NWA, the Crockett, the Crockett territory, all that kind of thing was just, this kind of felt like the end of it all. I know people kind of felt like that with Ric Flair's last match, but this really felt like that era's gone now. Like, it just ended. It's unfortunate, but it's kind of a way of passing the torch, kind of, so to speak, and letting the Young Guns take over now. So it's like a 4.5-star match. It's not like a 5-star match in my book, but just seeing Sting get the Scorpion Deathlock at the end, making Matt Jackson tap out was pretty awesome. And it just ended with everyone being happy. Like, what's wrong with a retirement match with everyone ends it being happy? You know what I'm saying? Like, not every retirement match has to be the sad thing where the guy loses.
I think it's something that WWE has kind of forced down everybody's throat. And I mean, again, I don't think we have enough feel-good moments, and that's probably going to come up again during WrestleMania 40 time. We'll see how that all shakes out, but I think it was a moment that was well deserved and well earned, and I would say that this is one of the best matches of Sting's career. It's probably going to go down as one of the better retirement matches of all time. Because Sting just got to look like a superhero, and that's clearly what everybody wanted. It's what Tony Khan wanted. And look, I think Tony Khan gets a lot of unfair criticism. I think he gets a lot of very fair criticism. But I think the way that he handled Sting was impeccable. I can't think of a single thing that Tony Khan did with Sting that I would critique. And in fact, apparently Ric Flair wanted to turn on Sting during this match, and I'm going to guess that Tony Khan's poo-pooed that idea, and I say, good for you, Tony. Way to stick to your guns, and we need to see more of that. We need to see more of Tony Khan sticking to his guns and getting rid of some people off the roster who probably shouldn't be there anymore. Chris Jericho. So yeah, I was a huge fan of this match, and this is definitely one of the better AEW matches that I've ever seen. And I mean, look, the Young Bucks are one of the best tag teams of all time. People are going to criticize them. People are going to bash them. But their body of work, when you look at everything they've done from PWG, Ring of Honor, Chikara, to AEW, I mean, they have to be regarded as one of the greatest tag teams of all time. Maybe the greatest, because how many tag teams have had a 20-year run at this point? No other tag team except for Mark and Jay Briscoe, RIP Jay Briscoe. Like, they're literally the only team, and they are essentially their peers. No other tag team has had this kind of sustained run. The Road Warriors had some runs, but they were in and out of different companies. The Steiner brothers, again, they were sometimes singles. Heart Foundation, Bulldogs, Midnight Express, Rock and Roll Express, Too Short. The Andersons, same thing. This is 20 years almost at this point. You think, and if you want to count like their PWG debut as like their first like essential, like their first mainstream exposure, again, we're talking 2007. We are talking 17 years, and we're talking about almost 10 years of them being with a national company in terms of Ring of Honor and AEW. So again, they're one of the best tag teams of all time. You can feel however you want about them personally. Personally, I don't like them, but they're still one of the best tag teams of all time.
For sure. Like, I'm not a big fan of them personally, obviously, but I can't deny that they had a memorable run in Reseda, and I wanted to tie this all together with Reseda because not only am I, my current job is there, the Legion Hall was there. So if you kind of look at back some of these Sting documentaries, he always points out that he was working at a Gold's Gym in Reseda, and I looked it up. It's like a few blocks from where the Legion Hall was, Jerome. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? So I'm working next to like history, where the old Gold Gym, it's not there anymore. They took it down, the Gold Gym. And then of course they took down the Legion Hall and turned it into something else. But still, like, when was Reseda this historical place for wrestling? And I never knew it until like recently. And all these like years later, putting all the pieces together, The Young Bucks made their name in Reseda. Sting was discovered in Reseda. Maybe it's more fitting that they ended up in Sting's last match anyway. So there you go, folks.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is one of the rare times that I think we've talked longer about the match than the movie. I don't know if that will be the case in the future, but certainly this was extremely memorable and a tremendous way to go out. So before we talk about what's going on next week, want to put in a special plug. Since we are talking about wrestling, Brian, I will be doing a very special WrestleMania Night 1 recap and review for this podcast channel that will come out the Sunday between WrestleMania Night 1 and WrestleMania Night 2. So I will have a special co-host for that. Brian will not be joining me for that, but I will have a special co-host, and we will be discussing WrestleMania Night 1. So be on the lookout for that.
For sure, and I'll be the one editing and putting all together, so I will put that together as fast as I can, because knowing WrestleMania weekend, it's always like prime to get that Night 1 review, and everyone's like hot about it, finding out about what's going on Night 1 and then going into Night 2. I'm not a big WWE guy anymore, so I'm not going to watch WrestleMania. I haven't watched WWE in a while, but I will put these together, and I'll be interested in what you guys talk about, because based on what I'm reading, I don't know if the story is going to be complete the way people want it. So there you go.
All right, Brian, tell them what we got going on next week.
So unfortunately, we talk about death on this podcast with Brandon Lee. Carl Weathers unfortunately passed away a couple weeks ago, almost about a month ago at this point. And we both love Carl Weathers a lot. We love him in the Rocky films. We love him in Predator. So we decided to, kind of take a look back at his career a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a double feature. We're going to talk about Predator, obviously. That's kind of what we agreed on, and we're both kind of mixed bag on that. And I have my feelings, and Drum's got his feelings.
No, it's not a mixed bag situation. I love Predator.
Okay, you love Predator. I love Predator 2. We'll talk about that. That weird
conversation. I mean, look, I'm a huge fan of Predator. All of the other Predators are not great. The Robert Rodriguez one is okay, but I mean, all the Predators except the first one are. I mean, this movie is impeachable. I'm going to talk about it all next week. Sadly, a lot of it is not Carl Weathers related. Like, some of it is, but a lot of it is Arnold and Jesse Ventura related. But I'm very excited to talk about it. And a movie that neither of us, I think, have ever seen. But I don't know if it's going to be good, but I'm glad that we're watching it, regardless.
Action Jackson, and I've read a lot about this movie, about how it did very well in the box office, yet it was sold to a different distributor after it was released and pretty much got swept under the rug, and it kind of cost Carl Weathers the whole franchise, man. And this dude was like, I don't know, it made a lot of money, and we're gonna go over the numbers next week. But this was a very successful film. It's on free on YouTube right now. But Action Jackson is like probably gonna be like a stupid action movie with a bunch of one-liners, and that's the point of it all. But it was a hit, and unfortunately we never got a sequel, and this has kind of been swept under the rug. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation, because I've read a lot of things about this movie and how I guess Carl Weathers got screwed over, man, because we never heard about a sequel or anything despite its success.
For sure. So we will be doing our Carl Weathers tribute next week, a double feature. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.